The immediate question is that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question. The member for Solomon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to talk on Appropriation Bill No. 3, 2010-11 and Cognate Bill. This is my first budget as the member for Solomon, a role I take seriously and never for granted. While I'm in this place, I will do whatever is possible to ensure that my electorate of Solomon, and indeed the Territory, gets its fair share of funding from Canberra. Despite the endless talk from Labor in the lead-up to the budget, this was not a tough budget. In fact, the Prime Minister was right when she said this was a traditional Labor budget, another big deficit, more borrowing, more debt and more taxes. In November 2010, we were told the deficit for the 2010-2011 would be $41 billion. On budget night, it was revealed it had blown out to almost $50 billion. In November 2010, we were told the net debt would peak at $94 billion. Well, on budget night, it was revealed that that figure was $107 billion. Not only that, the net debt is set to stay above $100 billion for at least the next 4 years. The government continues to borrow $135 million a day, and interest on Labor's debt will be a staggering $7 billion a year. $7 billion a year. Mr Deputy Speaker, cumulative interest on Labor's net debt will be more than $26 billion over the next 4 years. Think of the hospitals, the roads and the ports that could be built in this country with the interest payments alone. Labor doesn't like to admit that we have the highest interest rates in the organisation in the OECD and among the highest home mortgage rates in the world. Unfortunately, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor's reckless spending and borrowing has seen interest rates higher than they would otherwise be, and my electorate of Solomon has been hit hard. Since budget night, there has been near universal consensus amongst independent market economists that Labor's budget will have absolutely no impact on the Reserve Bank's need to raise interest rates. But still, the Reserve Bank is facing a myriad of inflationary pressures, particularly as the Federal Treasurer is predicting the economy will add 500,000 extra jobs over the next 2 years, bringing the jobless rate down from 4.9% to 4.5%. As a result, it's encouraging variable rate mortgage borrowers to consider fixing their loans as they prepare for 1 or even 2 interest rate rises in the second half of 2011. Mr Deputy Speaker, although house prices fell in Darwin and Palmerston in the first 3 months of this year, the median price for houses in Darwin still remains extremely high at $550,000, with a median price of $465,000 in Palmerston. Buying a house in Darwin is becoming increasingly unaffordable, even for key workers such as teachers, police officers, nurses, firefighters and ambulance officers. And according to the latest research from Bankwest, Darwin house prices have increased by 69% over the past 5 years. In addition to rising interest rates and unaffordable housing, families in Solomon are feeling the squeeze. Since Labor was elected, electricity prices are up 51%, gas prices are up 30%, water prices are up 46%, education costs have risen 24%, health costs have risen 20%, rent costs have risen 21%, while grocery prices are up 14%. In addition to this, a $26 a tonne carbon tax would add a further 25% to electricity bills, at least 6.5 cents to a litre of fuel. This proposed carbon tax will in fact see even higher prices for everything in the Territory. But who knows what the final price on carbon will be and what the ongoing impacts will be. The people of Solomon are very concerned about the increasing cost of living, and as I've already stated, they are paying record house prices, highest prices in any capital city for groceries, petrol and rent, on the back of soaring power bills and interest rates. Unfortunately, the carbon tax will affect every aspect of people's lives, and in particular those families that are already struggling to make ends meet. Many of my constituents will simply be unable to afford the power that they use. Mr Deputy Speaker, as mentioned in this place just 3 months ago, the carbon tax appears to be a tax on remoteness and the Territory. This tax stands to increase the cost of living and directly impact key industries in the Northern Territory and my electorate, such as primary producers, mining, tourism and construction. All of these will be hard hit by a carbon tax. In just 3 months, the already high petrol prices in my electorate have significantly increased without the carbon tax. Last week in Darwin and Palmerston, according to NT Labor's Government Fuel Watch website, the mean unleaded price for petrol was $1.52.8 a litre. $1.52.8 a litre, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is up 10.9 cents from February this year. Mr Deputy Speaker, I ask, how can the Gillard Labor government be trusted when the Prime Minister said before the election there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead, and now she continues to pursue the introduction of a carbon tax, a tax on electricity and a tax on petrol, a tax that is going to affect all Australians, particularly Territorians, ultimately increasing the already high cost of living. Mr Deputy Speaker, this budget is based on a lie. The carbon tax revenue and associated spending, tipped to be in the order of $11.5 billion, was not included. It is a tax Labor should be ashamed of, and a tax that the Prime Minister said would not happen under the government she leads. Now, my electorate of Solomon is in desperate need of infrastructure to make its economy more productive, and as already mentioned in this place by my colleague, the member for Hasluck, the Perth to Darwin Highway in the north of his electorate, Hasluck, is vital for both Western Australia and Northern Territory in terms of transport infrastructure. Heavy haulage transport engaged in the movement of machinery and goods south from Darwin and north from the electorate of Hasluck are being sadly neglected by this government. Trucks are being forced to operate within a curfew. Gigantic mining trucks being transported fight for space on rural roads, the same roads used by tourists. In Solomon, we are also in desperate needs of health infrastructure to give our people better access to health services. Giving credit where credit is due, I was very pleased to see the inclusion of funding for the first stage of a hospital in Palmerston. I have long advocated for better medical facilities for Palmerston and the rural area. Along with the many other advocates for improved health services in the Territory, we'll be keeping an eye on this program, making sure that what is promised is actually delivered. Mr Deputy Speaker, this government has not got a good track record in delivering what they promise. There is, in many occasions, a fair amount of spin involved in most of the announcements. This is something my electorate is tired of. While I was pleased to see a small increase in the funding for mental health, like the hospital funding, I will be watching this carefully to ensure that this is indeed an improvement in mental health services in Solomon. I want to make sure that this funding does translate into better mental health services for my electorate. Mr Deputy Speaker, there are more disappointing elements to the budget, in particular that families have been targeted and that the perception of being wealthy is now a family on $150,000. With the high cost of living continuing to apply pressure on family budgets and interest rates, we all know that wealthy is far from a $150,000 family. Mr Deputy Speaker, in the budget it was revealed a massive $1.7 billion blowout as a result of Labor's failed border protection policies. Families are paying for Labor's failed border protection policies through cuts to family payments. Many people in my electorate, family and friends across Australia, have raised with me their concerns regarding the significant expenditure on housing associated with the asylum seekers in the Territory. The view is that this money could be spent on infrastructure to build on the Territory's potential and funding long-term projects within my electorate. Mr Deputy Speaker, the budget clears the way for a $2 billion to be gouged from families through the freezing of indexation of family tax payment supplements and upper income thresholds. Families in Solomon will continue to feel a pinch. For example, a family with 2 children and a stay-at-home parent stands to lose up to $147 worth of benefits, while a family with both parents working will be $116 worth off. Families struggling to make ends meet on an income of $45,000 will also be hit. This Labor government's short-sighted measures and poor fiscal management are set to continue for the pain for families within my electorate of Solomon. Despite Labor talking down the impact of these changes at a time when families are struggling with the cost of living pressures, the truth is these changes will hurt 2 million families in some way, shape or form. I remind this House of the waste by this government associated with the failed pink bats, school halls and solar panels spend up. In this budget, one of the biggest savings was the $1.7 billion flood levy. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is a disgrace how this government has wasted so much money, yet incomprehensibly it could not find $1.7 billion in a $360 billion budget for allocation of natural disasters. It was extraordinary that, given this government's track record of wanton waste and failed program implementation, that Labor's big budget eve announcement was a plan to spend $376 million on set-top boxes for pensioners. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, let me remind the government that a post-budget survey revealed that 60% of pensioners don't want a set-top box. Additionally, we know Jerry Harvey said he could provide us and install them for $168 a unit, compared to Labor's budgeted cost of $400. The Prime Minister was asked by the member for Denison what they would do, or what Labor would do, with the promises made by Labor candidates in seats where Labor did not win. The Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box, hand on heart, and said our promises were fully costed, every one of them. Of course they'll be delivered. Of course they will. We don't go around making promises that we won't fulfil. Well, like the member for Herbert, I also have concerns regarding the statement made by the Prime Minister. Following on from her passionate statement of commitment in the chamber, I wrote letters to the Prime Minister on behalf of my electorate asking for clarification as to when will the pre-election commitments made by Labor be delivered in my electorate of Solomon. Promises such as $37,000 for Dragon Boats NT to maintain their current fleet and construct new Dragon Boats, or the $1.5 million all-weather World Championship level BMX track for the NT BMX. The new music and dance festivals, the Big Day Without, which is planned for March at Palmerston Senior College, April in Darwin Senior and Middle School, and May for Casuarina Secondary College. In June there was going to be one in Sanderson Middle School. Well, March, April and May have come and gone, and no events occurred. And when I contacted the schools, they weren't aware of any plans for any of these events. Then there was the promise of 1,200 new affordable rental homes in the Northern Territory, priced at least 20% below market rates under the National Rental Affordability Scheme. This particular promise was rebadged from the previous election. Now, it turns out that yet again there is an issue with delivery. Both NT BMX and Dragon Boats NT have been advised that they actually don't have the funding, despite all the pre-election hype. These groups now have to apply for grants through the usual process. No guarantee of funding at all. I wonder if this has something to do with the fact that these two particular commitments were also made by the Coalition. This is a very tricky government, one that has been caught out before. For example, this government has taken the high moral ground on education and closing the gap programs. However, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the lead-up to the 2010 federal election, the Gillard Labor government committed to the Indigenous Funding Guarantee program that affects schools in my electorate. The commitment was to provide increased funding to non-remote boarding schools that house more than 50 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students from remote Indigenous communities. Like the community groups NT BMX and Dragon Boats NT, schools such as Camilda College, St John's College and O'Loughlin Catholic College were under the impression the funding was guaranteed and to be backdated. Frustratingly for these schools, they still seek assurance as to whether the promised but delayed payments of the remote rate for remote students based at their school will indeed be backdated to include 2010. Now, I've raised this issue a number of times, and once again I pose the question to the Prime Minister: when can Camilda College, St John's College, O'Loughlin Catholic College from my electorate expect to hear the government's decision on whether or not this funding will be backdated? Additionally, I ask the Prime Minister, when will the pre-election commitments made by Labor in my electorate of Solomon be delivered? Mr Deputy Speaker, if the Coalition was in government, the people of Solomon would have the RAF-based houses available to them. The Coalition committed to excising the suburb of Eaton from defence, making 396 houses available for a variety of housing options for Territorians. This is in clear contrast to the current situation today, where this Labor government continues on its path of waste and mismanagement. 205 of the 396 houses sit vacant in the middle of a housing crisis. Is this an example of a government that values taxpayer resources? I don't think so. This is a government that expects everybody else to pay for its mistakes. Labor's working families of 2007 have become the forgotten families of 2011. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Solomon.